Hello and welcome to Multiverse Art of Polymers. You all knew it was a cello right from the beginning there. This is a very special concert. We actually started working on polymers during COVID with the MONET Project, who are this nationwide group of labs working on the next generation of polymers. We started working with them during COVID, and we did this online streaming concert, which was a ton of fun. But there's nothing quite like being in a room together, and it's so special to have you all here. But we also have the polymers here. That cello you saw coming together will be making an appearance later. You're all curious to see what it sounds like in the flesh, as it were. We've also got, I'm sure you've been paying attention to the musical robotics here from the WPI Music Perception and Robotics Lab. They will be finishing out our show. We've got some pieces by me and newly commissioned pieces for the program. So the first piece we're going to play, in fact, many of the pieces feature our solo cellist, who is really the star of the show. Let's welcome him up, Johnny Mark. Round of applause for Johnny. We're going to play. So there's one other reason that this show is special. You've probably, if you've been following Multiverse, we've done a lot of different science topics and strands over the years, but polymers are close to my heart. Just because of my own connection to science. My mum's a piano teacher, and I took after her. But my dad is a polymer scientist back in the UK. He's very quiet. He wouldn't talk about it a lot, but you just see these little napkins with molecules kind of strewn around the house. You think there's something going on here. And he actually made a board game for us once called Mad Molecules, and that board game actually inspired this piece. So this is my first polymer piece. It's called Poly Cello, and you'll see why, because there's Johnny, multiple Johnnies, as you will see in this show, in this piece. And it's a musician's attempt to understand polymers, and you're all going to get to delve into that polymer world as well. But it's we're going to hear a really good definition, so I won't spoil it. But a polymer, a big molecule, a chain of units repeating, a macromolecule. So there are lots of musical musical chains in this piece that are modeled after plastics. That one was polythene or polyethylene. And I kind of made some rules for how to generate them, and I sort of stick with them. But then we have the other metaphor is that the cello, we have 1 physical and 8 virtual cellos, making a kind of cello polymer. So we're going to play this piece for you. It's called Polycello. You've heard of musicians' take on polymers, but we are so lucky that this is a concert of music and science. So we have the science team here from the MONET Project. So it's my great pleasure to welcome up Dr. Jeremiah Johnson of the Johnson Lab and the MONET Project. Take it away.
Thanks very much, David. And how's everyone doing tonight? It's great to see you here. So as David said, I'm Jeremiah Johnson. I'm a professor in the Department of Chemistry here at MIT. I'm an organic chemist who likes to develop new ways to make polymers. And that's why it's really exciting to kick off the scientific portion of our program tonight. And I'm going to do that by starting with a question. What is a polymer? This is a question for the audience. Feel free to speak out. Yeah. Yeah, so a molecule that sort of has a repeating structure to it. Exactly. That's a common answer. You're right on point. And indeed, as a chemist, I think about polymers as materials that are made from molecules that start with small molecules we call monomers. Monomers can have a variety of different chemical compositions and properties, and it's those compositions that then translate into the properties of the polymers that we make and interact with every day. Over the last century or so, almost, chemists have developed reactions that we call polymerization reactions to take monomers and connect them together to make larger molecules that we call macromolecules, right? And in a macromolecule, the monomers are held together by bonds between them. All right. So now a macromolecule is larger than the monomer that it's made from, but it's still really, really small. So most of these individual molecules are maybe on the order of a nanometer to maybe 100 nanometers maximal. Now a nanometer is a billionth of a meter, so you can't see that. This laser pointer I'm holding is made of polymers. I can look really, really hard, but no, I can't. I keep trying someday. But if I could zoom into this far enough, of a billion times, what I would see is something that kind of looks like this, like a bowl of cooked noodles, where individual macromolecules are all kind of tangled around like strings and all in a web, this very complex three-dimensional structure that you're going to hear us talk about a lot today. Now, how do we think about the interactions between individual macromolecules with their neighbors in these kinds of materials? Well, in those materials, we can call those polymer networks, where we have multiple polymer molecules or macromolecules that are linked together by bonds. And we call these types of bonds crosslinks. They hold individual macromolecules together. These crosslinks can be strong bonds, or they can actually be relatively weak bonds, right? And depending on the strength of those bonds, we can vary the properties of polymers. But what this allows us to do now is go from the nanoscale all the way up to essentially arbitrarily large scales, and I can make this laser pointer that I'm holding in my hand. So a polymer network can be quite large. Now, with these definitions in mind, I want to ask you another question. How do you think we use polymers and polymer networks? Anyone want to throw out an answer? Everywhere. Everywhere. Good answer. You jumped ahead. You're ahead of slide. 3D printing, good guess. You saw that, right? Laser pointer, you saw that? Okay, good. I was hoping you might, give these people. All right, I just couldn't stop now. All right. Well, what I wanted you to say were sort of the more common ones that we think of as being bad. So, here's a plastic bag. This is made of polyethylene. Maybe like a household product container. A water bottle, polyethylene terephthalate. A toy, a car tire, rubber. You'll hear a lot about rubber today. Plastic straws. These kind of everyday items that we use, indeed, they are made of polymers. You hear the word plastic, you hear rubber. Those are polymer materials. And a lot of these, I think, we now associate with negative impacts, right, on the environment. Things like plastic and rubber waste accumulation. But what I wanted to convince everyone of, though I don't think I actually need to, is that polymers are much more ubiquitous, right? It's not just these things that we interact with. In fact, polymers are all around us. And I can convince you that if you look around this room, or if you're watching online, look around the room that you're in, and the majority of things you're looking at are made of polymers or have polymers as key components. So things like, just starting from the floor, this carpet, the chairs that you're sitting in, the clothing you're wearing, your shoes, most of the stuff up here, the walls, the ceilings, all have polymers, primarily are made of polymers. Okay, so we can't escape polymers, and in fact, in reality, the design of the next generation of functional polymers will not be achieved by doing away with them, but by, in fact, making better ones, by making more sustainable ones with novel function. And I want to point out as well that not all polymers are synthetic, and it was already said, we are made of polymers. In fact, here's an example. You see this wooden panel over here? My laser pointer is not seeming to work, but you see a wooden panel over there. Okay, well, wood, believe it or not, is a polymer. Here's its chemical structure. These are glucose molecules. It's actually two glucose molecules linked together, so the monomer of wood is glucose. And when that is linked together to make a long chain, we call it cellulose. You've probably heard of that material. Cellulose, once it achieves a high enough length, can interact with itself very strongly and make a mechanically robust material like wood. And we can build buildings out of it, okay? This is actually the most abundant biomass on Earth. So this would be the kind of material that hopefully chemists in future generations can start to use to replace the fossil fuel-derived chemicals that we currently use to make a lot of the polymers around us. But cellulose isn't the only natural polymer. How many people here have heard of DNA? Probably a few of you. DNA is a polymer. DNA is a polymer with monomers called nucleotides. Now, polymers don't always have to be made of the same repeating monomer. They can have different monomers. We call those copolymers. And DNA, in fact, is made of usually 4 different monomers. They have these letters A, T, C, and G. You've probably heard of that. And in fact, our genomic information, the code that brings us to life, is stored in the sequence of those 4 monomers on a DNA polymer. So when people talk about having their genome sequenced, that literally means that they figured out the order of monomers on a long polymer chain. Okay? And one of the reasons that's exciting is, in fact, 1 gram of DNA can store about 200,000 terabytes of information. Just 1 gram. And so there's a lot of interest in future data storage technologies actually relying on molecular encoded information. You can store orders of magnitude more information in a molecule than you can in any kind of other hard drive technology. DNA is not the only important biological polymer. You've all heard of a protein before. Proteins are polymers. Here the monomers are called amino acids. Who's heard of an amino acid? Yeah, most of you, right? So amino acids are essential nutrients because your body needs these monomers to build polymers. And proteins are actually, the workhorses, the machines of biology. They do most of the function. This is a really cool polymer, actually, because this is an image of one called the ribosome. The ribosome is this beautifully folded polymer structure whose sole job is to take a polymer template called a messenger RNA, mRNA. I'll talk about that a little bit later. You've probably heard of mRNA in the last few years. It takes that mRNA template and it converts it into a new protein, a new polyamino acid polymer. So this polymer's job is literally to read a polymer and produce another polymer. And as a synthetic polymer chemist, that's very inspiring. We can't do anything like that, right? We can make lots of cool materials, but nothing that can read a polymer and produce a polymer or store this much information. Okay. Now, not just amazing functions are found for polymers in biomedical applications or in biology, but many future technologies will depend on polymers as well. So just as an example, renewable energy harvesting. Every major technique that's out there, solar, wind, intimately relies on polymers in one way or another. So for example, the windmill that you see here in those large wind farms, they are made of polymers. They're polymers that are designed to be so stable that they can last in the environment for a few decades before needing to be taken down, and they can store and harness enormous amounts of energy in that time. Transportation relies on polymers, and as we move to further decarbonize this industry, we want to go to lighter and lighter weight materials. That's going to happen by replacing heavier materials like metals with newer materials based on polymers and polymer composites. And it's not just big things like this. This is an important one. This is a schematic of an mRNA vaccine. Again, you've probably all heard of mRNA vaccines in the last few years. mRNA, as I already said, is a polymer, and its job is to provide information to the cell to produce a new polymer, a protein. But mRNA outside of the cell is not very stable. Right? So you can't just give a person mRNA. It'll just degrade. So for decades prior to COVID-19, scientists and engineers were developing ways to package mRNA polymers in tiny nanoparticles that are themselves polymers. In fact, we call them supramolecular polymers. And then they are coated in a polymer shell shown with those little wiggly lines. So actually, the mRNA vaccines are a polymer mRNA packaged inside of a supramolecular polymer, a lipid nanoparticle coated in a polymer. And their function is to inject a polymer mRNA into your cells, for your cells, the ribosomes in your cells, to see that polymer, convert it into a new polymer, a component of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, so that your immune system can recognize that polymer and give you immunity. So it's all just layers of polymers everywhere. Okay. So polymers have been around a long time. So, what is left to do? Well, hopefully I've shown you some things that are left to do. We can't make synthetic polymers that do any of the things that nature's polymers do. But just to give you a little bit of that history, the very first synthetic polymer was commercialized in 1907, the early 20th century, by this person, Bakelin. Have any of you ever heard of Bakelite? Yeah, so a few hands raised. So that's actually the first synthetic polymer that was ever commercialized. And that actually happened before humans knew what polymers even were. It wasn't until 1920 that Hermann Staudinger proposed that polymers could exist. And later, when that was proven to be correct, he won the Nobel Prize for that. But still, that's a little over 100 years ago. So it's been a while. But the challenges that we face in this field moving forward, I'll go back to this mixed up bowl of cooked noodles. We just don't have a good way to understand and control the structure of these kinds of materials, like nature can. Nature can precisely control the sequence of 4 monomers in a DNA molecule that's meters long. We just can't come anywhere close to that. Right? And so as we look to the future, we want to try to dive deeply into these kinds of polymer structures and be able to elucidate key features of their structures. Some of those are shown here, such as, just to give you an example, molecular entanglements. You'll hear about those later today. These are cases where 2 polymer strands are kind of interlocked with each other. This happens randomly in a polymer. We would like to be able to control it, because those entanglements have enormous impact on properties. Other things like the formation of loops shown down here. You can imagine a polymer strand, instead of connecting with its nearest neighbor, folding around and connecting to itself. That actually has interesting implications on the properties of polymers, and we can't really control those or even really measure them in a lot of cases. Okay, so the challenge that we face to the next generation of materials is to link molecular structure to large-scale function. So, these are big materials, things I can hold and see, but the challenge, or the thing we must overcome to make the next generation is actually control them at smaller and smaller length scales, all right? And what that means, another way of saying that, is that the future of polymers is molecular. And I'm a chemist, so I'm really biased, but chemistry is the molecular science. And so I'm going to rephrase this to say the future of polymer networks is chemistry, right? It's really chemists that have the tools to synthesize and design these new kinds of materials. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce the team that David referred to, the MONET team, that has come together to tackle this challenge. So MONET stands for the Center for the Chemistry of Molecularly Optimized Networks. This is a National Science Foundation Center for Chemical Innovation that we built a few years ago that now involves 15 different principal investigators from institutions all over the US and around the world. This team, what's so amazing about this team is that this challenge of understanding polymer structure at the molecular level is quite daunting, and one that no single scientist or engineer could solve. And so on our team, we have synthetic organic chemists all the way to physicists, to biologists, to computational scientists, who each bring unique expertise to come together to address this challenge. And together, MONET is transforming polymer and materials chemistry by developing the knowledge and methods to enable molecular level chemical control of polymer network properties for the benefit of humankind. And so with that, I will turn it over, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Big round of applause for Jeremiah. Okay. No, I've been immersed, and I'd like to introduce our next musician. He's a composer commissioned newly for tonight, and he's something of a unicorn, because normally, we have to spend a long time getting our musicians to meet with the scientists and go to the labs and kind of learn everything. But this composer is a scientist as much as a musician, and he's heading into his postdoc now. But he's a fantastic composer, and he's going to tell you about his piece, Amir Bitran. Let's have a round of applause.
Thank you, David, for the very kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little to you guys and then present my newest composition. So my name is Amir Bitran, and I am the composer of the next piece. I'm also a PhD student in biophysics with Professor Eugene Shakhnovich just down the road at Harvard. And so I was really excited and honored to participate in this concert because of how near and dear to my heart polymers are, since I actually study them. Basically, I'm thinking of them during all my waking hours. So I am studying proteins, which Jeremiah gave a really nice introduction to. And the question I'm trying to understand is, how is it that as Jeremiah said, proteins are made of amino acids. Those are the monomers that are kind of strung together. And what I want to know is, from that string of monomers, how the polymer then actually folds itself up into a kind of intricate three-dimensional structure that then lets the protein actually do its job, right? Just like machines need a structure to function, just like the piano, like the cello, it's linked to the structure. The same is true of proteins. And when this process of folding, when the chain kind of doesn't fold itself up correctly, this can cause various diseases. So kind of nature does it really well. Sometimes it gets it wrong. We have no idea how nature does it, and we are nowhere close to kind of creating our own protein. So if we can kind of understand this, exactly as Jeremiah said, then that's kind of the future of biomedicine and biotechnology. So I'll link it a little bit to the music, right? So I'll talk a little about how I think of the connections between my work in science and my work in music, especially as it pertains to this particular piece, polymer entanglements. So one thing that, I'll just go on to the next, Jeremiah, I didn't realize it would be such a nice introduction. I was going to talk about what polymers are, but I don't have to say anything about that now. One thing that really fascinates me, both as a scientist and it's something that translates to music, is the fact that macroscopic things that we observe in our day-to-day life, like the wood, plastic, whatever, the properties of these materials are really determined by things that go on at much smaller scales. So as was mentioned, there are these polymer networks that make up a lot of these materials, and the polymer networks lead to, they make up materials whose properties we can describe. Like some of them are elastic, some of them are tough, some of them are more brittle, and all of this depends on what the polymers are actually doing. So in some cases, you have like a very regular patterning. In some cases, as Jeremiah mentioned, you have like loops, you have kind of gaps in the network. And for me as a composer, I was just thinking, how can we take this idea of something small, a sort of sonic unit, and then zoom out over time into something bigger in such a way that the musical properties of what I started off with actually translate into what we hear at the end. And so that's exactly what the fantastic Johnny Mock is going to show you guys on the cello, where you'll hear a little polymer snippet at the beginning, a little string of notes that sounds like a little polymer, and you'll hear defects, you'll hear accents, you'll hear silences, and then you'll start to hear a really cool kind of echo effect where the polymers will start to kind of intertwine with one another, and as the piece goes on, we'll like zoom out from this network and see a sort of larger and beautiful macroscopic structure. So with that, I hope you enjoy the piece.
Okay, we're going to bring up the next members of the science team to look at some research happening right here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Clara Triano and Sophie Melvin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Clara Triano-Valls, and I am a third-year PhD student in the Department of Chemical Engineering at MIT.
And I'm Sophie Melvin. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Chemistry at Johns Hopkins University. Today we are going to talk about the scientific inspiration behind the piece 10,000 Rays of Hope. So rubber is a term that describes a broad class of polymers that are both naturally derived and synthetically made. We use it every day in medical products, in our clothing, yoga mats, hair ties, tires. It is essential to our modern day way of life. We all know rubber is kind of squishy. It has this tendency to stretch, but it also has a resistance to that stretch. This property of rubber is what makes it so important to us, but that being said, not all rubber is created equal. So let's test this together. Could I have 2 volunteers come join me?
Don't be shy. We've got
Okay,
one.
I need one more, 2.
One and
Okay.
2.
All right. Come on up front.
Enter the multiverse.
All right. So I'm going to ask our 2 volunteers. What are your names, actually?
Kote.
Anne. Okay. I'm going to ask you guys to carefully, without breaking it or snapping it on your fellow volunteer, to stretch this green resistance rubber band. So you can each take one end.
Just watch the robots behind you. Can we move you forward? That's it. There we go. There we go.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, thank you. You can now relax. Okay, how difficult was that to stretch? Not very. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you had to give it a number. 2? Okay, all right. I'm going to ask you to do the same with this yellow resistance rubber band. Okay, and you can relax now. Thank you. All right, scale of 1 to 10. 4? Okay, so the green was 2, the yellow was 4. All right, now the black one. Okay, thank you. All right, scale of 1 to 10. How hard was that to stretch?
6 or 7.
6 or 7. Okay, so they increased with strength. Okay, could I get a round of applause for our scientists?
Hey,
Thank you.
2 more scientists.
Congratulations, you just performed a qualitative tensile test. So a tensile test is an experimental test that allows us to quantitatively determine the stretchiness of a material. Putting a number on the stretchiness allows us to determine what a material is best suited for. Okay, so the way we perform an actual tensile test is we cut a sample, which is usually in the shape of a dumbbell, and then we clamp it in a machine, and then we pull on it until it breaks. So as the machine is pulling on our sample, it's measuring a few things. It's measuring the force it takes to stretch that sample, and it's measuring how far that sample is elongating. So from these measurements, we can extract certain properties, including the stiffness of the material, the strength of the material, and how far that material can stretch before it breaks. So, and these are important because having a number assigned to your specific material allows you to compare one material to another and also determine the application that that material can then be subjected to. Another way to think about these tensile tests is if you imagine a musician trying to hold a very long note. So just as musicians have a capacity for breath until failure, materials have a capacity for stretch until they break. So.
Thanks so much, Sophie. So tensile tests are super important to the work that I do in the lab. But before I tell you why, I'll tell you a little bit about the materials that I make. So I make rubber composites that are composed of some proportion of unused, new rubber, and some proportion of post-consumer tire waste. And the way that I do that is I take tire rubber, basically it's been ground up into little pieces. We call this material rubber crumb. It looks like rubber sand. And I take this rubber crumb and I coat it with an adhesive that I make. And this adhesive serves to glue the post-consumer part of the composite to the unused new rubber. So tensile tests are super important to my work because, of course, they tell me how my materials work and how well they work. So I can make my material, it's composed of these 3 parts that I just mentioned. I can cut it into dumbbells, and I can tensile test it and learn how tough it is, how strong it is, how much stretch it has. But more specifically and more important to me, it tells me about how well my adhesive is working. So basically, if I keep every other part of my system the same, the rubber blend, the post-consumer tire waste, I can change something in the adhesive. And if I change something in the adhesive and I find that my material works horribly, like the toughness is gone down, it's not strong anymore, it's not stretching, then I can know that I should definitely not make that change to the adhesive, right? And so through this process of trial and error, I can kind of filter through these different parameters and change my coating in certain ways and eventually kind of stumble my way towards a material that actually works and that hopefully paves the way towards more effective ways of tire waste management. And so here I've included for your entertainment a video of me kind of puttering around in the lab and doing one of these tests myself. Any experimentalist will tell you it's very simple, but I figured it would be fun to look at. So this is a tensile tester. It's a pretty simple machine. It just needs to rip things apart. So I am attaching grips, and these grips serve as the clamps. So they'll hold onto the dumbbells of my sample. So here I am having some trouble with the bottom one. And then attaching an identical one on the top. And then I just need to calibrate this instrument so that the grips don't crash into each other and ruin the machine. And now I'm just putting my dumbbell in there. So I've just got to clamp it in there and make sure it's straight. And I'm sorry this shot is kind of sideways, but you can see that the machine is kind of stretching out my dumbbell, and it's mercifully been sped up for your convenience because it takes around 5 to 6 minutes for this thing to fully stretch. So. And there it is. Ah. It's actually kind of scary when it happens because I get bored by like the 3rd minute, and so I'm on my computer, and then it's like, it's kind of terrifying. So it keeps me awake. So right in front of me in that shot, you can't see it in the video that I just showed you, but there is a computer screen and it outputs data that looks something like this. So this is a force elongation curve, and every curve on this graph represents a single dumbbell. And so the force on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, represents the force that the tensile tester needs to exert on my sample in order to stretch it. And the elongation on the x-axis is just a measure of that stretch. So for example, my dumbbells are 22 millimeters long. If my dumbbell is stretched to 23 millimeters long, then my elongation is 1 millimeter long. And so as you can see, when we stretch the dumbbell more and more and more, it takes more force to stretch my sample. And that means the polymer chains in my sample are kind of stretching out and they're packing. And they don't really like that pack, that perfect order. And so it gets harder and harder and harder to stretch them. And then finally, pull them far enough and long enough, the bonds start breaking. And you can actually see it if you look closely when you test the sample, but you can see like the formation of this little divot in my dumbbell, and then very suddenly it kind of propagates through my sample and breaks. And so that's this big drop, of course, when my sample rips. And so this data, which I gave to David, has been sonified and provides a lot of the inspiration for this next piece, 10 to the 4 Rays of Hope. And I'll let him take the lead on the intro.
Well, not before we get a round of applause for you two. So, leave that up there. Do you want to know what this sounds like then? Let's hear it. Here we go. So we can follow along. That was the real sound of the rubber breaking at the end, but slowed down a little bit, Hans Zimmer style there. So that's a sonification. So what I'm doing as a composer is I'm taking this data point as data points, and each data point becomes a musical note, and the longer the stretch, the higher the note, and it's a way to experience, because if you look at this, you know, it's a graph, we see lots of graphs, but if you can experience the data, well, it can affect you emotionally, and you can take it to on a deeper level. So I could say that each data point was played as a note. Anybody know what instrument it was? I'll give you a hint. Each one is a cello note. So Clara sent me this data, and but not only that, is I got to visit the lab, and I think labs really should be an open place for everybody, for artists and for people from all walks of life, because you get to see this very, very focused work, all these machines, but it's in pursuit of an amazing goal, which is a sustainable future. I mean, Clara mentioned that the rubber that she's working on is recycled rubber. I mean, my son's in a tube on his bike, got a puncture. If you can't fix it, you have to throw it away. It ends up in a tire field, and it just sits there forever, leaching chemicals and polluting our environment. So these experiments are part, I've come to believe that they're part of that climate sustainability future that we all want to be part of. Small efforts that, if we could recycle all the tires from our cars instead of throwing them away, rubber products, not just grinding them up, but actually making something that is strong and useful. So it's experiments like Clara's that are the rays of hope that I think we need at every level of society to get to the future we want to. So that's the name of the piece, 10,000. If we had 10,000 Claras and Sophies, I think we'd have a better world. So one more round of applause for them. And let's bring back up Johnny. We're going to play the piece. Here we go. From the beginning, in the flesh, as it were, here is our 3D printed cello. And Johnny's had a couple of weeks to get to know it. And, well, he's going to give you a little demo. There we are. Hey. So, Johnny, we wanted to ask you, as a professional cellist with years of experience here, what's it like on this instrument? How close are we?
Well, actually, it's quite close from the structure of it, because if you took everything away from the cello, the thing that actually makes sound is really what you see here. Now, of course, for structural reasons, we're trying to make sure that there's a foundation in the bottom, so that the strings can be strung on and pressure, so that we can create, well, sound. So now, of course, when you listen to this, what were some of your thoughts? Like, what did it sound like? Yeah, exactly. Not much resonance. Now, of course, like the resonance is really kind of what kind of drives you to thinking, oh wow, the cello sounds beautiful. Now, that's really all the sound box, which is just the structure of the wood itself. So, but this has nothing really. Like there's really like it's a small little pouch of sound box right there. So, of course, in this case, there's really not much that you can hear. So that's why we have quite a bit of. I had to lean quite closely to the mic in order for us to hear that. So, but if you took everything out of that wooden box, that's pretty much the sound you hear.
Well, we might have some way to go. The dream is we can all just print up a cello in our home, and I believe we're going to get there. With a slightly, wouldn't that be great? We could just print any instrument. I want to live in that world. So anyway, we made a little arrangement of the Rays of Hope for printed cello version. So here we go, little mini arrangement here. So we're on to our last of the science presenters to talk about a very interesting topic. He's going to introduce Jaffer Fakil. Here he is. There we go.
My name's Jaffer. It rhymes with laughter. I'm doing my PhD over at Duke University, but I'm from Boston, so it's nice to be back. And it is my intention tonight to introduce everyone here to the concept of a mechanophore. But before I do that, I want to reiterate a point that was made beautifully by Dr. Johnson. Not that point. Go down, up. I'm holding it upside down, that's why, yeah. Typical. Good, okay. That point is that chemistry, that in particular polymers, are all around us, on top of us, and inside of us, because as Dr. Johnson has mentioned, the reality of the world around us is fundamentally chemical. But we don't think about the world in a chemical manner. That is, we don't typically spend too much time pondering the chemical structure of our hair or our clothing. We think about the world in terms of objects and actions, so things that we can hold and touch, or actions that we can take with these things. So when we think about chemical reactions, can anyone here think of a chemical reaction that occurs with objects you can hold, see, and touch? Yeah. Rust. What a great point. Rust. Yeah. Look at that. Yeah, you read your lines. Good one. So rust is a great example of oxidation, which occurs, and if anyone here has ever toasted a marshmallow or a piece of bread or a piece of meat, you've exploited the Maillard reaction for that very nice browning, and for our everyday movement or for strenuous physical activity, we rely upon anaerobic respiration by ourselves. So processes that we can see and that we can't see but are vital for our existence all rely on these chemical reactions. And the reason why I am mentioning these different kinds of chemical reactions is because before I ever started studying science, I had a pretty narrow conception of what a chemical reaction was. When I was in middle school, I remember I was watching Prison Break. Anyone here ever see that show? And there was this episode where there was something along the lines of what was going here. There was a guy mixing two chemicals inside of a vial, and at the time I looked at that and I thought, that's what chemistry is. You take a vial that has a pretty liquid, and then you pour another liquid in, and you get a third liquid. That's pretty, middle school conception of what chemistry is. And indeed, there are many laboratory scale reactions wherein you take chemicals and you mix them together. And if you ever take a chemistry class, you might also see that in order for these chemical reactions to work, we have to heat them up to maybe 100 degrees Celsius, or we have to shine a light on them for these reactions to run. And there are a few other ways to make chemical reactions work. And one of them, which is a historically relatively new way of making reactions run, is by exposing them and treating them with physical force. And molecules which can undergo chemical reactivity by treatment with that force are termed mechanophores. And my favorite way to introduce the concept of a mechanophore is with this fun GIF we have on repeat of a material being smashed with a hammer and transforming from colorless to blue. And the chemical transformation that's occurring here is from the molecule shown on the left, called spiropyran, embedded in the molecule, which transforms to the molecule shown on the right, which is the mercyanine version of the material. Now, when I showed this video to a friend of mine, his immediate response was, well, so what? What's the big deal? When I hit my finger with the hammer, it also turns blue. To which I replied, fair point. But unlike the case of the blood vessels bursting in your finger, what's occurring here is a very precise chemical transformation with the most indiscriminate application of force imaginable. And the fact that we can achieve this level of chemical precision within a polymer network not only showcases how far the field of mechanochemistry has gone in the past few decades, but also what's arguably one of the most beautiful things about mechanochemistry, which is that we are exploiting this conventionally destructive force of, in this case, compression, into a productive force of force sensing by color change. And one of the ways we can think about this is with this animation that was provided by Dr. Patricia Johnson of Duke, who has analogized and represented a polymer chain, or a polymer strand, with a golden chain shown here. And as you can see, that when this chain is stretched, the spiropyran molecule stretches from the spiropyran colorless version to the mercyanine brightly colored blue. And Dr. Ilya Kevlishvili of MIT has done this molecular simulation of the same molecule, spiropyran, undergoing the conformational change to the brightly colored blue molecule shown here. Wow, that's pretty. Look at that. So this is one example of a mechanophore that exhibits color change upon being activated by force. And one mechanophore that my lab has studied extensively, in addition to this one, and before I talk about that, what we can do with this spiropyran mechanophore is embed it within a piece of rubber. And this is a great way to introduce K through 12 students to the idea of mechanochemistry, because we can exploit this fact that the material turns blue upon pressure being applied to it. And so you can actually write without even using ink by just using a Teflon stylus. And so the second mechanophore I want to talk about is what's called formerly known as a bicyclic mechanophore, but I call it the reactive strand extension or stored length mechanophore. And Patricia has shown here, again, a little schematic with a golden chain. But I would like to ask if anyone would like to play tug of war. Could I get one person? Yeah, let's do it. Okay, am I cheating correctly? Cool. So we're gonna step right over here. What's your name?
Jonesy.
Jonesy, I'm Javver, nice to meet you. And so I'm going to ask that you grab the rope here, and I'm going to grab this here. And so within a polymer network, when can we step back a little bit? Yeah. So within a polymer network, when you pull on it, those pieces of rubber that Clara was showing, when you pull on them, or when you tug them, or you hit them with a hammer, the strands at some point end up getting stretched. And so, Josie, could you pull hard with your right hand and try to break open this? Yeah, okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine, no worries. No, that's good. It was intended. I'm cheating. I'm gonna win the tug of war game. So, yeah, don't tell them it's a slip knot. And so, with this knot, the idea with reactive strand extension, excuse me, this went backwards. The idea with reactive strand extension is that my remote does not die. The idea, David could be, thank you. The idea with reactive strand extension is that this knot shown here acts as a sacrificial weak bond. And so when the polymer strand undergoes tension along the chain, as it's being pulled, what happens is that we get this release of stored length. And the fact that the polymer chain grows longer upon being pulled upon and releases this amount of stored length ends up providing some tear resistance and some extra stretchability to the material. And so if I activate this, right here, you can actually see another molecular simulation of the bicyclic molecule breaking open into a new conformation wherein the polymer chain becomes longer. Thank you, Jonesy. And the reason why we're excited about this process, which we've coined reactive strand extension, is because when we embed these RSC units and we install them within materials, we can vastly increase the stretchability and the tear resistance of the materials. And what I want to emphasize is that I'm showing this and I'm representing it on the macro scale with this rope, but given the nature of the chemistry of these materials, we may be embedding millions or trillions of these repeat units within these materials called hydrogels to increase their tear resistance. And it will continue to be pulled for some time. And just like with Clara's, we will wait with patience, diligence, all the good traits, until it eventually, I timed my pop wrong, but it's fine. Until it eventually, RC is great, look at that. It just keeps stretching forever. I think I have the animation shown on the right. We are almost there, almost there. 3, 2, 1, 0.5, 0.3, 0. There we go. And the reason why our collaboration in our lab cares about mechanochemistry is because we believe that mechanochemistry has the potential to really change the game and shape how we make the next generation of our materials, not only through the direct responses that these mechanophores have within materials, but also in understanding the nature of fracture and the chemical nature of these polymer networks. And within our collaboration, we are constantly looking to form new mechanophores, build fundamental physical relationships, and advanced polymer networks like the ones we just showed, and collaborate with more groups and perform outreach opportunities whenever possible. So that's all I have for you all for tonight, so thank you.
Jaffa Fakil, everybody. Well, they've been here all night. We've been waiting for them. It is my great pleasure to introduce a composer and dear friend of mine, Dr. Scott Barton of the WPI Music Perception and Robotics Lab, with our final piece of the evening.
Hi, all. Thank you very much. I'm Scott Barton. I am a composer and musician, but I also founded and direct the Music Perception and Robotics Lab at WPI. And so as a composer, the reason I'm interested in musical robots is not to replace humans. It's rather in realization that humans have amazing, unique, expressive abilities. We've heard a lot of them tonight. I'm a guitarist. I also play piano. And those are things I want to preserve. But at the same time, machines are capable in ways that we are not. And the way that I see the musical world is that these are all sort of colors on the palette, right? That I write for acoustic musicians. I use electronic sounds. And I also use musical robots. And musical robots are really interesting because they're this sort of midway point between the virtual, that sound making that we do completely within a computer, and the acoustic. They can't just do anything. They are bound by physical forces. They are idiosyncratic. Some ideas sound good on them, some of the ideas don't. And learning to compose for them, to me, was very much like working with human musicians. And like, you learn their strengths, you learn their weaknesses, and you adjust your ideas accordingly. So that's how I come to this, thinking about how I voice these compositions. When David invited me to this project, I was very interested because of sort of some of these direct connections between polymers and the materials I use to make robots. These are, this is PLA, this is 3D printed PLA, there's acrylic here you see, right? So these synthetic materials are very much part of my practice in making instruments. And then when I came to this idea of mechanophore, which was just wonderfully described by Jaffer, I was really inspired compositionally. And what happens is, so in this particular case of spiropyrin becoming methionine, there's that point where this transition happens. It's called a ring opening. And what I took the metaphor to mean is it's force is involved, and force is so important in music. Force is how we tension strings. It's how we tension membranes over drums. We strike membranes, we pick, right? Like, force is an inherent part of making sound, of exciting vibration. And so I thought of this idea of providing force, and it gets to this threshold where the ring opening occurs. And then what happens is a communication of state change, right? There's the state change, and the material is communicating that to the outside world for us to see. We saw examples of color change, right? That's one way it happens in this particular case. But as I talked to Patricia Johnson in the Craig Lab, were wonderfully and fantastic collaborators in educating me about this subject and providing also materials. But one of the ideas is when the state change happens, we have knowledge of the state of the material, right? If it's near breakage, we suddenly have indication, like a visual indication. But it can even potentially lead to another chemical reaction that's excited, where the material could heal itself. Right? And so I love this metaphor, and as I composed this piece over the, during the pandemic, I was thinking about this idea of, okay, representing this reaction and the application of force and tension. We get to this ring opening, but instead of the typical outcomes of that sort of breaking, whether it's despair or anger, I thought of like the ring opening happening, something beautiful coming out. And so that's what I represent in the piece. And so metaphorically, I'm really interested in the microscopic. I wanted to see what was happening with these mechanophores, like see with my eyes, like what do the entanglements look like? What is the bridging? What is these forces that are involved? But such things aren't possible, so I tried to imagine them in sound, and that's what I made. So you'll hear in the piece the process of a ring opening, and then it becoming this texture. I will quickly introduce the performers that have been made by the lab. This is PAM, polytangent automatic multi-monochord. Maybe polypolymer tangent. Yeah, we'll change that. Then Scyther is a human playable robotic zither. And then we have these percussion arms. And so the idea to take this one step, this collaboration, the synthesis one step further, I also wanted to make instruments out of the polymers. And so what we did, the Craig Lab sent me samples where we have these membranes of the drums are actually infused with spiropyrin. So the idea is when you tension the spiropyrin over the drums, which are PVC pipes, so I was thinking of this like organic synthetic dichotomy. So we have organic polymers in terms of wood, but also PVC pipe, and then this material, this membrane, is made out of the spiropyrin that shows its tension, right? So I wanted to use the metaphor in a figurative way, but also in a literal way in the construction of the instruments. So you will hear all of this in my work, Mechanophore, for electronics and musical robots.
few things. So that is our show. The next Multiverse is December 3rd, and it's called Reef Music, all about coral reefs, and looking at, coral bleaching, which is a pretty tragic tale, but also the work of scientists at BU, coral restoration. And that one is for families, so kids, it's in the afternoon, so check that one out. Join our mailing list at multiverseseries.org, and I can say there will be another run of Black Hole Symphony in 2023 at the Science Museum, so we'll let you know as soon as we have the dates. I'm David Ibbott. Let's have everybody up on stage for our final bow. Here we go. Whole team. Got the whole team. Okay, Amir Bitran, Scott Barton, Clara, Sophie, Jaffa, Jeremiah, Johnny, Vince LaRoe, our sound guy extraordinaire. Our streaming artists at the back, Raja and Omkar, Anna Banatska, Science Director, MIT, and all the folks at MONET. Final bow with the team.
And David.
Thank you. Come say hi. We'd love to meet you, and we'll see you in December. Thank you. Let's go experiment.